We're about to dive into one of the most unbelievable stories in all of economic history. It's a story about zeros, a lot of zeros, desperation, and a banknote so huge it absolutely shattered world records. This is the story of the currency that literally printed itself to death. So let's just jump right into the big question at the heart of all this. It seems so simple, right? If a government is short on cash, why not just fire up the printing presses and make some more? Well, as it turns out, that exact thought process is what leads us to the single most extreme case of hyperinflation the world has ever seen. To really get our heads around this, let's make it super simple. Imagine an entire economy that only makes one thing, 1 million books, okay? And let's say there's $10 million floating around in that economy. That means each book costs 10 bucks. Simple enough. But what happens if the government just decides to double the amount of money out there to $20 million, while the number of books stays exactly the same? Well, the price of each book is going to shoot up to $20. It has to. Think about it. The money itself isn't what's valuable. The books are. The money is just a way to claim those books. And when you double the number of claims without making any more books, each claim is suddenly worth half as much. That's it. That's inflation. And while a little bit of it is pretty normal in an economy, what happened in post-war Hungary shows us what happens when you push this idea to its absolute terrifying limit. So let's meet our main character in this whole drama, the Hungarian pengo. And what's so fascinating here is that this story doesn't start with a crisis. Nope. It actually starts with stability. See, the pengo was brought in back in 1927 for one reason: to clean up the economic mess and inflation left over from World War I. It was even pegged to the gold standard, and you know what? For over a decade, it worked like a charm. By the early 1930s, it was actually the most stable currency in the whole region. But then, World War II happened. The war completely wrecked Hungary's economy, and with huge bills to pay and almost nothing being produced, the government reached for the only tool it had left: the printing press. And this is where things just go off the rails. We're talking about a downward spiral into hyperinflation so fast, so severe, it's honestly hard to even wrap your mind around it. This was the point where money just stopped being money. Get this. At the absolute peak of the crisis, in July of 1946, this is how long it took for prices in Hungary to double: 15 hours. Just try to imagine living through that for a second. Everything you'd ever saved, your entire life's work, would be worth nothing in less than a week. You'd get your paycheck in the morning and literally have to sprint to the store, because by dinner time, that same money would only buy you half as much. The entire fabric of society just starts to come apart when money becomes meaningless. Things got so crazy that the government had to literally invent new words to deal with all the zeros. First, they came up with the milpengo, which was short for a million pengo. But pretty soon, that was just pocket change. So then they had to introduce the bipengo, which stood for a billion pengo. But get this, it was actually a trillion pengo. The numbers were just out of control. And if you want one fact that perfectly captures the madness, here it is. The highest value banknote ever actually put into circulation was the 100 million pengo note. That's 100 quintillion pengo. And when they issued this note, with 20 zeros on it, it was worth about 20 US cents. Okay, just look at this table to see how fast everything fell apart. In August of 1945, you needed about 1,300 pengos to get $1. By May of 46, it was 59 times billion. And just 2 months later, by July 10th, it took 460 nonillion pengos to equal a single dollar. That's a 46 with 28 zeros after it. The currency wasn't just collapsing, it had effectively ceased to exist. So, how do you possibly stop a runaway train like this? Well, the answer is, you don't. You have to totally scrap the train, tear up the tracks, and start over from scratch. Hungary had to perform a hard reset on its entire monetary system. Take a really good look at this number. That is 400 octillion. It is one of the biggest numbers you will ever see in a real-world context. What on earth could this number possibly represent? That was the exchange rate. When Hungary finally introduced its new currency, the forint, they set the conversion at 400 octillion old pengo to one single new forint. It was a complete and total abandonment of the old currency.
To put it as simply as I can, on August 1st, 1946, the government basically just lopped 29 zeros off the end of its money. It was the largest denomination removal in economic history, a brutal but absolutely necessary move that finally ended the world's worst ever case of hyperinflation.
So, okay, what's the big takeaway here? What's the lesson? Because the story of the Pengo is so much more than just a wild piece of history. It's a perfect, if terrifying, example of a fundamental truth about money, about prices, and maybe most importantly, about trust.
The famous Nobel Prize winning economist Milton Friedman once said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Basically, he argued that it's just what happens when the amount of money grows way, way faster than the actual stuff an economy produces. And honestly, the story of the Hungarian Pengo is probably his theory's most dramatic proof ever.
This whole idea is wrapped up in what economists call the quantity theory of money. And really, it's the exact same principle we talked about with the books at the very beginning. All other things being equal, if you double the money, you eventually double the prices. There's this direct, almost mechanical link between the two. So what happened in Hungary after the war wasn't some weird fluke. It was a textbook case of this principle in action. You had this unbelievable increase in the money supply, which was chasing a totally destroyed supply of goods. And what was the result? An equally unbelievable rise in prices. The connection was crystal clear. So why are we talking about this nearly 80-year-old story today? Why does it still matter so much? Because it is the ultimate cautionary tale. It proves, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that a currency's value isn't just made up. It's anchored to the real productive capacity of the economy it represents. And when you cut that anchor by printing money like there's no tomorrow, the value just vanishes. And that brings us right back to our first question. What the story of the Pengo really teaches us is that the value of our money isn't in the paper or the metal. It's in the actual goods and services it can buy. And just as importantly, it's in our collective trust, our belief that it will still be able to buy things tomorrow. If you break that trust, all you're left with are worthless pieces of paper.